Welcome back. I am Abyss. Please have a seat.
I drive the van for work, delivering products to a few family-owned stores around my city. On a night just 4 months ago, I was driving my route between 3 stores to do some after our deliveries. It was about 11 and I had just finished the last delivery for the night. From there, the warehouse I had to drop the van off was 30 minutes away. I drove for maybe 5 minutes until a car pulled up behind me at an intersection. There were no other cars out, just me and them. When the light turned green, I started driving, and it wasn't until a few more minutes down the road that I realized they were still right behind me. I was in a big, slow van, so most people would just go around me, but they didn't. I wasn't worried or anything, but it was odd. As we continued driving, their headlights steadily got brighter and brighter until they were so close that the light was being blocked by the back of my van. They had to be just a foot or two away from my bumper. The lane next to us was open, so they could easily just go around, but instead, they chose to tailgate me, which then started making me nervous. I slowed down to a stop sign and was going to turn just to get away from them, but just as I stopped, the car behind me bumped into my van. The crash wasn't bad, but it was enough to shake the whole van and push me forward a bit, which I knew had to cause some damage. I put my van in park and unbuckled, about to get out to see the damage, but a man was already at my window. He was smiling and motioning to talk to me. I opened the door, and as I stepped out, I saw 2 more guys at the back of my van, both looking at me. The man started to give excuses as we walked over to look at the bumper, but it became obvious that he was very drunk. His words were hard to make out, and he didn't seem very bothered about crashing into me at all. The other guys looked intoxicated too, just from how they were moving, but I didn't know for sure. My van and his car looked a lot worse than I thought. I asked the man for his insurance and went to get mine, but when I got back, I realized none of them had moved. I asked again for his insurance, but all of them just looked at me without saying anything. There was this moment of me looking at them as they stared at me in silence before my heart started racing. I turned to run back to my van, but instantly I heard all of their footsteps coming up behind me. I didn't even make it to the door before one of them grabbed me and shoved me against the side of the van. The one holding me was making threats while the others went back and forth, piling up everything in their car. After a minute of having my head pressed against the side, he shoved me away and started forcing me to walk toward their car. The other guys finished taking what they could and got in the car, telling the man behind me to hurry up as he opened the back door and tried pushing me into the back seat. I knew that if I let him get me in that car, I would likely never be seen again. I put all of my strength into fighting back, doing everything I could to make it as difficult as possible to get me inside. After a 20-second struggle, he tossed me away and got in himself. Then they drove off. I got up and ran to get my phone from the center console, and called the police. The men who attacked me couldn't be identified and still haven't been, and it was hard to say if it was a one-time drunk attack or something they had done before. What they planned to do by bringing me in the car with them is also a mystery, but I think we all know what would have been the most likely outcome. I started to think calling the police would be worth it, especially if he was going around to other people's houses and doing the same thing. I turned to get my phone, but then there was the sound of footsteps departing. I looked out again, and he was gone. After giving it some thought, I felt that this was still too creepy to not inform the police about. Whatever that man was doing was not normal. I called and let them know about it. They said they would send an officer to patrol the neighborhood and see if they could get the man to stop or explain what he was doing, but that was about all that could be done at the time. I thanked them, then hung up and checked out the door one more time before going back to the couch. The whole thing had really worn me out though, taking away the relaxing night, just making me exhausted. I shut everything off and went upstairs to get in bed, but as I got in and turned off the lights, a thump sounded from downstairs. I sat up, and then it came again. It was loud, like someone smashing something against a wall. I got up and ran to the top of the stairs. And now hearing it for the third time, I realized it was at the front door. Someone was hitting something against it, like they were trying to forcefully break it down. I walked down a few steps and looked over, seeing the door violently shake every time they hit it. It looked like they were just a few hits away from breaking it down. Now absolutely terrified, I locked myself in the bedroom and called the police again. The operator said that an officer was in the neighborhood and would be here in just a minute. But through their voice I heard would shatter, the door slamming against the ground. Footsteps quickly moved through the downstairs, going into every room without stopping. Then they began moving up the stairs, but were cut off by the officer pulling in and running up to the house. The intruder immediately stopped and ran for the back door as the officer came in and yelled at him. And apparently they had trouble getting the back door open in the heat of the moment, so the officer was able to get him down and into the car. The man, who looked like a psycho up close, refused to say anything, like not even a single word before they drove him off. His intentions were clear though. He was carrying a heavy hammer and had a bunch of zip ties in his pocket. That doesn't exactly sound like a coincidence considering what he was doing. Why he chose to go for my house isn't clear though. But what likely saved me was calling the police that first time. If I hadn't, the officer wouldn't have been in the neighborhood so close by, and likely would have gotten here too late for me to have ever been seen again. I work for days a week in 10 12-hour overnight shifts, which means I have to sleep during the day and be up at night at least for days a week. However, switching up my sleep schedule on my days off usually causes me to get much worse sleep and just feel tired. So I started sticking to the same schedule all week. I'd usually get in bed around noon and wake up at 8. It was hard to get used to, but I had to do it for work, and after a few months it wasn't too terrible. On one of my days off a few months ago, I got up at midnight, having breakfast and doing some chores, then went out for a run just before midnight. This was a somewhat normal-looking day off for me. Sometimes I would have my lazy days, but for the most part I try to go for a run within the first few hours of my day. My house is right next to a forest preserve, so I take the same path every time. It's basically just a big loop inside the forest preserve, and I'll go around it as many times as I need before I feel like I'm done. I started going along this trail, looping around it 4 times before a man appeared on the path. When I first noticed him, he was too far down to see well, but it looked like he was just walking. As I started to get closer though, I realized he wasn't moving. He was wearing a dark sweatshirt and baggy pants, facing my direction as I approached him. When it passed by, he slowly moved his head to follow, like he was watching me. I looked back and saw him still standing there. It creeped me out and had me thinking for a couple minutes, but when I looped around again, he was gone. I don't know if maybe he took a shortcut through the woods. The exit was on the opposite side from where he was standing though, and he definitely didn't pass me on the path. Him having appeared and left in such a strange way gave me a bad feeling, causing me to cut the run short and head home. I left the forest and jogged through the street to my house. When I got inside, I chugged some water and sat down, only to be startled up by a sound outside my front door. It was almost 1 a.m., so nobody should have been at my house. I walked up and looked through the peephole. I was visiting my family for the holidays last year. They live 15 hours away, and I usually try to tough it out in one long drive. But this year's snow had come early and made driving a lot slower, so I was prepared to stop at a hotel somewhere along the way. I didn't book anything in advance since I didn't know how far I'd get before wanting to stop. I was just going to pull into wherever and see if they had a room available. When I left, it was barely snowing, but the further out I got, the more snow seemed to be coming down. Roads were still clear, but everyone was definitely driving more slow and carefully. Around 8 hours into the drive, I still hadn't made it halfway there. I was getting frustrated as it was already midnight, man, it was just taking so long. I should have been over halfway there at this point, but now I felt like I had to keep going so that my drive tomorrow wouldn't be even longer. The snow had let up a little bit, but it still had accumulated on the road because there were no plowed rocks. I drove as long as I could, making it to 12 a.m. before deciding I'd had enough and needed some sleep. I pulled off the next exit and into a small motel parking lot. It was a long one-story building with 10 or so rooms. As expected, it wasn't the nicest looking place. The outside looked really old and even the lights on the sign were dim and half burnt out. I parked in a random place near the rooms and got out, walking up to the main entrance area. Inside it was a very small room with front desk, but there was a sign propped up on the counter. It said, "Be back in 15, with a little picture of the coffee cup on it. The chances of me arriving while the worker was taking their break just showed my lack of luck on this drive. I walked out and back to my car. But this time when I looked around the parking lot, I noticed something that I hadn't before. It was completely empty. I stood there in the cold and looked for a minute and didn't see a single car. And from the looks of it, it didn't look like any cars had even been in the parking lot tonight. I got back in my car and turned on the heat to warm up while I waited. Seeing no cars and nobody at the desk had me second-guessing whether the sign was actually for someone taking a break. There were no places within 15 minutes anyway, so I don't know where they could have driven off to if they were taking a break. I sat back and tried to think of what to do next, but my eyes and head were so tired and I ended up passing out in my seat. When I woke up, a few hours must have passed. The snow had started pouring down again and the wind was making my car sway. I sat up and looked toward the front entrance to the motel, but immediately made eye contact with a man peering in through my window. I jolted back as he stepped away and yelled something toward the parking lot. I looked behind him, seeing a truck on the other side. Another man got out at the driver's side and started walking up. The one by me then walked around my car, trying all the door handles. I snapped out of it and put my car in reverse, trying to back out, before the wheels spun under me. Now the men were moving quicker, one yelling at the other to come over to his side and break the back window. I continued moving my car back and forth, trying to get through the thick patch of snow, but the sudden shattering of the back window only made it harder. I was trying everything now as one of the men was reaching in for the door handle, and just when he put half of his body through the window and opened the door, I finally got traction and spun the car around. The man fell out and the other tried to get in his truck to follow me as I turned the car and made my way out of the parking lot. Once it was back on the road though, they stopped following me, although I don't feel like it was entirely my fault. I definitely should have not let myself fall asleep in that parking lot, especially in the middle of nowhere like that. What those men had planned could have been anything. They were obviously prepared though, and it almost seemed like they knew that this motel parking lot was an easy place to target people. But whatever it was, I'd probably never know. I worked at a retail store in my 20s as an overnight lid. It wasn't one of your regular big chain grocery stores. It was a local place with only about 80 people. Drunk when I was in high school. I had just turned 16 and got my driver's license, and my parents were always wanting to start off-road delivery. I didn't want to be a waiter or work at the register, so driving sounded like a good option. When this happened, I had been doing deliveries for a few months, so I was pretty comfortable with it. It was a Thursday around 8 that my dad gave me in order to deliver. I got in my car, which was actually my mom's SUV, then started to drive. Google Maps said the house was 25 minutes away. Our town was small, so 25 minutes away was actually pretty far. As I drove, I started to recognize the area as being on the edge of town, and I still had 10 minutes to go. I'd never been this far out in this direction before, so I was definitely paying attention and keeping my eyes open. I wasn't scared per southeast, but just felt uncomfortable. The only houses I was passing now were farmhouses far from the main road. When the directions told me to turn, it was down along a paved path going straight to one of these farmhouses. Now I was starting to get a little freaked. A farmhouse this far out at night was probably the last place I wanted to be, but I knew I was probably just spooking myself, and it was just a simple delivery. I drove down to the end of the path, which ended and just became a small grass field in front of the house. It wasn't clear whether or not to drive in the grass, so I just parked the car there and got out. It was eerily quiet. All I could hear were my footsteps on the grass as I walked up to the house. The porch light was on, but no other lights were on inside the house. I was looking over my shoulders constantly and walked quickly. The longer I was out there, the more uncomfortable I was. Just before I reached the porch, I heard something. It sounded like it was coming from the backyard behind the farmhouse, but it was loud like a wooden door opening. I stepped onto the porch and dropped the bag on the doorstep, then rang the doorbell and started rushing back to the car. I was regretting how far I parked and wished I just drove on the grass, and as I listened to the only sound of my footsteps under me, I started to hear more footsteps running behind me in my direction. I turned around and saw 3 men sprinting at me through the grass. I tried to run back to my car, but in seconds I was tackled to the ground. One of them held me down while another started taking everything from my pockets. I was yelling and screaming for help, but I knew nobody could hear me. It all happened really fast, and once they looted my pockets, one of the men kicked me in the stomach and they all ran and got in the car, turning around and driving away. I got up and just watched the headlights disappear on the long empty road. I had no phone and no way to get back. I didn't know what else to do than just start walking toward the road. When I reached the road, I started walking down the way I came. I had no way of telling time, but I think I was walking for 30-40 minutes before a patrol car pulled up in front of me. My parents had called for them to check on me because I wasn't responding. To sum it up, the cops found a small barn behind the farmhouse with another restaurant delivery bag inside it. They think they tried to do the same thing to someone before me, but probably missed their chance or chickened out for some reason because there were no other reports. The actual owners of the farmhouse were out of town, so they had no involvement. My phone was able to be tracked though, and was found thrown in a field off the side of the road not too far away. The stolen car, however, took 3 weeks to be located. It was found nearly 400 miles away and had been almost entirely emptied. This was almost a year ago now, and those 3 men that attacked me still have yet to be identified.
Okay, that's it. Thanks for your listening. I just started telling stories on YouTube. If you like my story, please like this video and subscribe my channel. I will make more story for you.